We're going to take a look now at some of the command line arguments that we can use to interact with the Hadoop file system. We're going to use a real live Hadoop cluster that consists of 4 nodes. Later on in another lesson, we'll learn about how to configure this system and some of the things we're going to take for granted now, such as account names and so forth. We'll cover that later. Right now, I just want to use this as a way to introduce the command line tools for the Hadoop file system. So the first thing we want to do, just to confirm, we have, in case I talk about different things, we have a real cluster, and if we look at Etsy hosts for this cluster, there's 4 nodes, starting with head node, N0, N2, N1, and N2. So when I talk about nodes, these are the nodes we're going to use. And as we'll learn when we install, the head node is both a data node and the client node in this case. And N0, N1, and N2 are also data nodes. So since we're talking about HDFS, we now have a 4-node HDFS file system installed. As a user, the first thing I'd like to do with my file system is usually type ls. And in my local file system, I have files such as this listed here. And then if I move to a directory called lesson3/data, you see I have a directory called my files and a directory called warandpeace.txt, which is the text dump of the War and Peace novel written by Tolstoy. And if you have any extra time, you can certainly read the content. It's a standard text file. Now, what I'd like to do is move this into my Hadoop file system. So the first thing I'd like to do is ask, how do I see what's in my Hadoop file system? Well, as I mentioned before, we don't use the standard tools like ls or rm that operate on our local file system, but we have equivalents for Hadoop. So the way we do that is, and again, we're assuming everything's installed correctly, we use the command Hadoop and then a module name, and there's various modules. In the case of the Hadoop file system, there's one called DFS for distributed file system, and then our command, which we start with a dash, so -ls. So if I enter this command, what I'm going to get is what looks like absolutely nothing in my Hadoop file system. And just to be sure, I'm going to do an ls/ and see, let's look from the top of the file system. And at this point, we see there's some different directories listed, and you'll notice that there's a user directory. And if we do dfs-ls/user, so now we're going down the tree a little bit in our distributed file system, you'll notice that it didn't work because I used the standard user USR that's usually done in Linux and Unix systems. To avoid confusion, in the Hadoop file system, there's an E in it for user. So if I do it this time, now I see that there's 2 subdirectories in user, one named Doug, which is what we're working in now, my account, and HDFS, which is the Hadoop file system administration account, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So now I'm going to look into Hadoop DFS-ls user/Doug and see what's there. I do that and I find there's nothing there, which corresponds to the same thing as when I did Hadoop DFS-ls, and that showed me that there's nothing there. So this illustrates the first point, that Hadoop is going to assume your user directory, in this case user Doug, is where that's your home directory. So there's the Hadoop file tree, but when you move stuff into the directory, it's going to put it into your home directory. So let's do a simple copy and move. So recall we had in this directory, we had War and Peace. So let's do a Hadoop DFS, the module, and in this space, it's going to be, instead of copy, it's going to be put. And when we do that, we're going to move that file into our Hadoop space. So let's do, there's our file. Let's put War and Peace. And if we don't put anything, it's going to ask us for a destination. And so we need to specify what we want to put it in there as. And let's just call it War and Peace .text. So we've put the file into HDFS, and how do we know it's there? Well, we'll just go back to our command and ls our directory, and lo and behold, there's our file under user Doug War and Peace.text. Now, a few things here. You'll note after the permissions space here, there's a number 3 in front of the word my account name Doug. That 3 is the replication count of that file War and Peace. So when I loaded it into my 4-node cluster, it's been replicated on 3 nodes. And not necessarily this all the same. The different blocks have been replicated on different nodes. Now you also notice that the size of this is War and Peace is only 3.2 megabytes in size, so it's much less than our 64 megabyte block size. Still, it's going to be replicated into the HDFS. And we also notice that the file size reported here is exactly what it was reported before in HDFS and in our home file system. So that's how we move a file in. We can also do things like HDFS mkd, make a directory, and call it whatever we want. And again, if we go back and ls the file system, the Hadoop file system, we see we have, there's our directory we created, and it's marked as such with the directory. Notice there's no replication because it's a directory, and indeed, the directory only exists on the meta server. The directories don't exist on data nodes because, remember, blocks are just sent out to the data nodes, and the metadata server or the name node keeps track of all that information. One thing to remember is uploading data into HDFS first copies the data to the data nodes, and then when all the data exists on the data nodes, it acknowledges that the writes were successful, and then the name node confirms that and acknowledges that the writes have happened. So what this means is we won't have any partial writes of data into HDFS. You can be assured that if you write something into HDFS, it's either all or nothing effort, and if it fails, usually, and in almost all cases, HDFS will compensate and use another node. The thing to remember is your transfer into HDFS is very robust, and what you copy there will end up there. To give you some examples, there are ways to pull the data back out of HDFS, which you would assume. So let's just illustrate how we might do that. First, let's make a new file in a sense. So we're going to do DFS, use a move, and we're going to do the file name, and let's just change it to another file of some sort. So again, checking what we've done doing ls. So now War and Peace has become another text. So we just changed the name, and that's so that if we move it back out, I can prove to you that I've done that and we don't overwrite the initial file. There is a way to copy data back out of HDFS, and as you can imagine, that's probably called the get command, the opposite of the put command. So we're going to use get to get the file back out of HDFS, and what I've done is renamed it. If I look in Hadoop DFS ls, I've renamed the file to War and Peace to another .text. So to move it back out, I'm going to use a command called get Hadoop space DFS, now this time get, and we're going to lead off with the file in HDFS, and then we're going to use the file name we want to use in our standard file system. So we do that, and I'll take this opportunity to illustrate one of the things that happens. I got the help for Hadoop DFS is because I forgot the little dash here in front of the command. And you may find yourself doing that a lot. That's the first thing to check when you get some help for the Hadoop DFS command. Make sure your dash goes in front of the command. The tendency is to write commands like ls and copy, cp, without dashes because we do that all the time for Linux file systems, Unix file system. So now I got my commands right, and if I look at my local file system now using just ls, you'll see here the file, another text has shown up, and I pulled that back out of Hadoop file system. Now, if everything worked correctly, both of those files, since I just moved one to the other, should be exactly the same size, and they are. So that's an example of using a put and get. You can also use, instead of put, you can use something called copy from local. However, I find put and get just a lot easier to use and write, as long as you remember the dash in front of them. We're going to now use Hadoop DFS to copy a whole directory of files into Hadoop file system. If we look at the current directory, we see there's a directory called My Files, and if we look in that file, that directory, we see there's 3 files called F2, F3, and F4, each about 3.2 gig in size. And what we'd like to do is, instead of copying them individually, obviously, we'd like to copy the whole directory. So in order to do that, it's fairly obvious, as you might expect. We're going to do, let me just clean up my command here. We're going to do Hadoop DFS, a dash put, the whole directory, which is My Files, and then we're going to put where exactly we want to put it in our HDFS file path under user Doug, basically. So, and again, we mentioned that there are permissions, so we can only basically operate on data in user Doug at this point. So we do that, and if we now take a look at, we see there is a directory at our HDFS file system. We see there's now a directory of My Files, and there the files are. And if you're clever enough and quick enough, you can see that the sizes are exactly the same. And again, each one of those has a replication count of 3. We can also remove files from HDFS. And suppose I didn't really want to move that whole directory, I can very easily remove it by using something called -rmr, and the directory name. So that's going to basically remove the whole directory. And it gives me a nice little message here that it's now moved that directory with all those files in it to trash. And I have a directory called trash when I delete things that now shows up in my account in HDFS. So as you can see here, when I did an ls, after I deleted something, it put it into trash. So I can always undelete or bring it out of trash should I want. Of course, if I delete .trash, then it's gone. So the advantage is that in case I decide I want something back and really don't delete it, it still stays there. The need for trash, actually, if you think about it, if you've moved very large files into HDFS and you inadvertently delete one or a bunch of them, it's actually kind of nice that it keeps them around in case you you say, oh yeah, it was a mistake, you don't have to reload all the files into HDFS, which could take some time. If you remember back to how we copied files from a client node to HDFS, it is really a serial process and it's writing redundant copies, so it's not all that fast a process. So you want to have the trash is a nice way to just say, we'll keep it until you're really sure you want to get rid of it, because copying big files in can be difficult. And that operation, actually, the trash, is very simple, because on the name node, it really is just changing the designation of the blocks. It doesn't do anything on the data nodes. It just says, okay, I'm going to drop it in the trash. And these are considered trash now. So the data is still there. And of course, you see that the directory isn't there either, it's in trash. And we could look at that if we want. I won't bore you with those details. The other thing I wanted to say is if you wanted to remove a single file, obviously I want to get rid of another.txt. I just use the dfs-rm another.txt option, and it'll just delete that file as well. And again, it tells me put it in the trash. And if I take a look at it, now all I've got is the whatever directory in my trash directory. So my current working space is fairly clean. So these are the basic commands you need to navigate the HDF file system as a user. Should you be curious of what other options there are, I'm certainly not going to cover all of them. You can use the help option, Hadoop DFS-help. You'll get a big long list of all the possible options, and as I scroll through, you can see there's ls, lsr, move, copy, etc., all the way down, make dart, tail, chmod. You can change group, change name, change the name, ownership, etc. Pretty much everything you can do with the standard Linux file system or Unix file system as you would in using any other local file system. The best way to learn this is when you have a Hadoop file system is to take a look and play with it a little bit, and you'll get a feel for it. The idea of moving files back and forth is fairly easy as long as you remember to Hadoop space DFS and then your dash and your command. It works fairly well.